Alright, so today we're going to learn how to add and subtract decimals. We must recall how to name the decimals, but also how to line up the decimals. So I'm going to teach you how to add and subtract using just 2 to 3 steps. Notice here we have two numbers. On this side over here we have the 4 and 25 hundredths, 2 and 12 hundredths. Well, if I wanted to add these two numbers together, the first step I need to do is just to make sure that I line up the decimals. What does that mean if I wanted to line up the decimals? Well, essentially what it means is that the decimals have to be on top of one another. So let's rewrite this. Let's say we want to add these two values. So I'll have 4 and 25 hundredths. I want that decimal to be right on top of the other one, and so I'm going to go ahead and add my values now. I have 2 and 12 hundredths. Now when I line up the decimals, the numbers will also be lining up, and so they'll match up with one another in the correct place of values. Step number 2 then would be for me to add or subtract. So add or subtract. And remember, when we add and subtract, we're going from the right to left. So if I'm doing this, I'll draw my line. Let's say I want to add them up. Okay, so I'm going to go start on the right-hand side. So I'm going to start on this side over here, going down. 5 plus 2, that gives me 7. 2 plus 1 is going to give me the 3. Notice the decimal is going to go straight down, so I'm just going to drop the decimal. And 4 plus 2 gives me 6. Okay, so if I wanted to add the values, that's all I would need to do in those two steps. The same would be true if I wanted to subtract. If I want to subtract these two values, maybe I'll start with the 4 and 25 hundredths. I want to line up that decimal, so that's the first step. I want to line up that decimal. I'll put in my 2 and 12 hundredths. And again, this time I'm going to subtract them. And I'll subtract 5 and 2, that gives me 3. The 2 and 1, that gives me 1. The decimal comes straight down, and 4 minus 2 is 2. So notice it's quite easy to follow these steps when the values are the same. Let's say though that I make it a little bit more challenging this time, and I'm going to change the values. So let's say instead of 4 and 25 hundredths, I'm going to go with 4 and 125 thousandths. And I'm going to give you a different number this time. I'm going to give you the number of 2 and let's start with a bigger number. Let's go with 22 hundredths. So the steps here actually will not change, but the way we think about it, the way we might look at it might change. So let's look at the addition first. So first I'm going to set in my numbers. I'm going to put in 4 and 125 thousandths. Notice again we want to line up the decimal, so I'll put my decimal down and I'll place in that 2 and 22 hundredths. Now if I add these two values, there's going to be one more step in here. Notice that we only have 2 here, but the third step I might add in here would be to making sure that we plug in zeros. So anytime we see this extra space, right, anything after the decimal, we can just plug in a 0. It doesn't change the value of the number. So we'll plug in our zeros. So for example, if I give you the number 2, the sum, or not the sum, I'm sorry, the another number that we can represent 2 as is 2 and 0 tenths, or 2 and 0 hundredths. It's really the same value. So anything behind the decimal, it doesn't really count. So that would be the third step. And then again, we want to add it from right to left. So I suppose maybe that could be an intermediary step between 1 and 2. So 5 plus 2, again, that gives us 5, 4, 3, and 6. Okay. So that would be the only change that we'd have in the addition. Notice that in the subtraction, we'll have something very similar. So let's take a look at the subtraction. If I take 4 and 125 thousandths, 2 and 22 hundredths, and I subtract, that 0 still needs to go in, and this time we're going to subtract. So I'm going to subtract the two values. 5 minus 0, I'm going to get the 5. 2 minus 2, I'm going to get 0. And oh no, I need to borrow. So again, we're going to borrow from this 4. The 4 becomes a 3. The 1 becomes the 11. 11 minus 2 gives us the 9. And 3 minus 2, that's going to give us the 1. So this would be our final values. Okay. So follow through the steps, practice with the questions I've assigned until you have this down. If you have other questions, please post them in the comments.